This podcast is made possible by your support and your donations. Thank you. And by the purchase of my book called Everyday Buddhism, Real-Life Buddhist Teachings and Practices for Real Change. I will post an affiliate link to the book on Amazon in the show notes. And if you've already read it, please take a minute to rate and review. And also consider purchasing it again for a friend or family member as a gift. Welcome to Everyday Buddhism, making every day better by applying the proven tools found in Buddhist concepts. Welcome to episode 97 of Everyday Buddhism, Making Every Day Better. I am very happy to share the wisdom of Gemma Naturkach, a member of our Everyday Buddhism community and Sangha. I asked Gemma to join me for a conversation on the podcast after listening to her share her reflections and insight about her experiences as a refugee from Ukraine. Gemma is an ICF and IPEC certified coach and founder of Social Media for Coaches. She is also a U.S. Army vet and a member of a three-culture family. She is deeply committed to using her experiences to champion the voices of those who have been uprooted from their homes. Her wisdom was sharpened through her own experience as she and her family made their way from Ukraine to Wisconsin in February 2022. After asking her to be a guest on the podcast, I found out that Gemma has written a book called Surviving Patriotism. It's targeted for release in the upcoming year, 2024. This work serves as a testament to her emotional journey during her and her family's evacuation and subsequent resettlement. I am so happy I was able to share this conversation with Gemma, my Sangha sister. It really helps give us a bigger perspective, a perspective from the real life experience of a woman trying to make sense of everything that happened to her and her family who were driven from their home and their country because of war. Among other things, we talked about how home and community is where you make it, the complex emotions of hating and then trying not to hate the enemy, how rage doesn't think, reflect, or consider, how war is romanticized, and how we feel pressured to pick a side, labeling one as bad and the other as good, and the ways we might help when we feel utterly helpless. I am positive Gemma's reflection on her experience, her honest sharing of what she went through, and her thoughts along the way may help you see war, anger, rage, and propaganda from a broader and clearer lens, a lens outside of our cultural or tribal bubbles. I know it did me. A note about the background noise on Gemma's audio. She has some chatty parakeets, but I think they add a lot of cheeriness to an otherwise heartfelt and painful subject. So without additional introductory comments, the conversation starts now. I am here with Gemma Naturkach, a member of my Everyday Buddhism community and Sangha, and I'm so happy to have her agree to be a guest on the podcast. Welcome, Gemma.
Hello. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, everyone listening. I'm so excited to be here, and it's an honor to be speaking in a thoughtful space regarding all of these topics that we're going to go over today.
Yes, exactly. And that's, I feel so blessed that I have somebody sort of embedded in my community to be able to address these things. Um, and as I've shared with you privately ahead of time, I've been awed, and this is not, I just told Gemma I wasn't BSing her. I've been awed by the amount of reflection that she's done about her experiences fleeing Ukraine and the resulting wisdom she has so eloquently shared with our community. So when I started hearing more and more about her experience, I was like, and especially as soon as the war happened in Israel, it was like a pile-on situation of violence and war. Um, and this is when I knew I needed to invite you as a guest on the podcast, since it seems the timing is right to, like, calm down, chill, get our
Yeah.
crap together and so forth. But before we go into the deep dive of the emotions, the insights, the reflections, I wondered if you could just give us a sort of your background story. Who are you? You've been a lot of places, so this may take a while, but feel free to take your time to explain who you are and where you've been before we get to Ukraine and you're having to flee.
Sure. So my name is Gemma. I come from a third culture family right now. So when I say that, my daughter was born in Ecuador. I was born in the United States. My husband was born in Ukraine. So we have a lot of cultures coming together and languages as well between all of us. It's English, Russian, Ukrainian, and Spanish. So we have a different perspective on a lot of things. And we've learned early that really home is where you make it, because we don't really fit in anywhere. And at the same time, we're able to kind of adapt everywhere. So, apart from that, I am an Army veteran, and I focused mostly on being a combat medic, and also I was in the chemical division as well.
Can you clarify that you were a United States Army veteran?
Yes, yes. I was a U.S. Army veteran, and
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, there's that aspect of it, especially when we start talking about, war and things like that. So I have the civilian perspective and also a veteran perspective. And, of course, I've lost lots of friends in the military as well. And that's just another layer of what we will be speaking about as well. So, yeah, I grew up, as far as how I got into Buddhism. I grew up in a household that was a teenage mother that got pregnant. I was a result. She was drug and alcohol addicted. And I kind of grew up just taking care of her. She got pregnant with me when she was 16. She didn't really believe in God at all. And so it wasn't something that came into our household. But what I learned is that she would be whatever religion to get benefits or donation or anything like that. So I grew up kind of with a basic understanding of so many different types of religions. And at the same time, I didn't really have a good relationship with any, because I saw like the deception that went into it, at least from my mother's side.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, why is everybody ignoring this? Like, I would tell people, like, I hate living with my mother, like, please take me. But nobody would do that. And so as I grew, I knew, like, I needed to get out of here and leave. And that's kind of what I've done. So
Is that why you
traveled.
joined the Army?
Yeah, that
Mm.
was one of the reasons that I joined, so I could get out of the United States and leave.
When did you join the Army?
So That's a good question. I don't remember the exact year. When was it? 2005 is when
So,
I entered. Yeah.
so it was in the midst of um, Iraq
9/11. And
and
yes.
yeah, okay. Got it. I'm
Yeah.
just trying to place all the craziness, right?
Yes, yes. So, and I wasn't in very long. So while I was in the military, I ended up getting sexually assaulted and then I was discharged. So I spent time after that working for the government, like in the Colorado Springs area. And yeah, I wasn't happy there. And I traveled for work and I ended up um, having some medical conditions, and they told me that I had what's called a pseudotumor cerebri, and they wanted the VA or the Army Veterans Affairs. There we go.
Yeah.
They wanted to do brain surgery and insert a shunt into my brain, and pretty much told me like you're not going to be able to work for a while. And I was supporting myself. So I packed up and moved to Ecuador. I'm like, well, if I'm going to die, I need to be able to live off my army money, my army disability check. And yeah, so I moved to Ecuador. I had my daughter there, and I ended up working online and was hired by Microsoft. So then I worked for Microsoft and I met my husband there. And he was from Ukraine. And then I ended up moving to Ukraine and we got married. And then my job, I worked at Microsoft Ukraine. And then of course that led up to the evacuation and leaving Ukraine to come to the United States.
Wow.
There's so much in between, but I mean
I
that's
know
kind
there
of the gist of it.
I know you're leaving a lot out, but that's almost more than most people can even process. Do you understand? Most, I think, that's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you didn't have the operation for the tumor, right?
I did not. After
No.
I looked into it, I felt like there was more disadvantages than advantages to having the surgery. So I didn't do it. And then when I went to Ecuador, I magically got better. Don't know how that happened, but I have
Well,
been healthy ever since.
and also could have been a misdiagnosis, right? That's I think,
Absolutely.
yeah. So they know sometimes you have these strange conditions. I call them strange, but conditions that are strange to the medical profession in that they can't fix it, right? And so
Yeah,
then they place something they can fix onto the thing they can't fix, which
absolutely.
can cause you more problems than the original thing. That sounds ridiculous, but I think you and I know what I'm talking about. I
Yes.
have a couple of overlapping autoimmune conditions, and it's always like the treatment is seemingly always worse than the disease. And whenever they say we
Absolutely.
could try this, we could try that, and I always say no thank you, no thank you, no thank I'll,
Absolutely.
I'll live with what I got. I understand it. The devil you know, right, is better than the devil you don't know. So here you are after a pretty traumatic childhood, early adolescence, early adulthood, in Ukraine, but you've married a wonderful guy, you have a wonderful child, and it sounds like you found a place in Ukraine that seemed great for you, comfortable for you, right? You became since you kind of like beat it out of the United States, it sounds like you adopted Ukraine as your country. Am I?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Is that true?
Absolutely. I mean, my daughter, she grew up there. Like her first school was Ukrainian school. Like she learned to write in Cyrillic alphabet before she
Wow.
did English alphabet. So also, I mean, I had a sense of family there. Not only did I have my husband, but his family, like they were more like family than my own family.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it was just, that's where we live. That was our home. So coming back here has been an adjustment, but now of course we've made this our home as well.
Yes, but I think that's the key to the making your home in Ukraine kind of sets the stage for
Oh,
the
absolutely.
trauma of having to lose it, right?
Yes.
Once you found it. And we'll get into that, but um your story, we'll talk more about your story as far as where it gets you in the thinking about it, what happened in having to leave, and all the things you went through. I mean, the emotions are probably overwhelming for both you and your husband and your daughter, I would imagine. I'm sure your
Mm-hmm.
daughter has a little bit of trauma there too. I know you guys probably take care of it very well, but much of what you've shared with our community is
Mm-hmm.
about learning how to reflect and deal with feelings of hatred and division towards the so-called enemy.
Yeah.
Enemy is a word used in a lot of Buddhist literature because it's something we can understand, even though we may not want to think of it as an enemy, right?
Yeah.
But the way you have shared this, and this is, I'm sure you will get to this because you are eloquent in this. You freely share these things. It reflects the sort of the deepest of Buddhist wisdom, really, the deepest of Buddhist wisdom. And interestingly enough, it shares what President Biden spoke about yesterday with something I imagine you didn't even know about. But he flew to Israel yesterday, and despite what you think about political or this or that, he had some, I thought, brilliant things to say in about dealing with hatred and
Mm-hmm.
rage and all the things that happen. And he said that he gave a gentle warning to both the country of Israel and the people of Israel is not to give in to what he calls primal feelings. And
Mm-hmm.
I think we can understand that. And he said not to let our overwhelming grief and despair or over overpowering anger drive the country so far as he believes America did after September 11th, 2001. So he
Mm-hmm.
was criticizing that. And he said, this was his quote. He said, shock, pain, rage, all consuming rage. He said, and this was an address to the Israeli people. And he said, I understand, and many Americans understand, you can't look at what has happened here to your mothers, your fathers, your grandparents, your sons, your daughters, your children, eat babies, and not scream out for justice. Justice must be done. But I caution this, while you feel rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes because rage will make you make mistakes because
Mm-hmm.
it rage doesn't think, it doesn't consider, it doesn't reflect. And I'm going to just say this, and I think this is going to kick you off into everything you want to say. This comes from, and I don't know if you know this book, Gemma. This is comes from The Way of the Bodhisattva by Shanti Deva, which is the Dalai Lama's favorite book. It's one of my favorite books. It's my Bible. I have it in every room of the house. Um, and this is the line I wanted to read. It's the verse. It's written in verse, which is beautiful, and it's written by this Buddhist teacher thousands of years ago, but he sounds like he's talking about today. And it's absolutely amazing. And hopefully our Sangha will study it together very soon. So he read in the chapter on patience, there's this verse that says, although it is their sticks that hurt me, I am angry at the ones who wield them, striking me. But they in turn are driven by their hatred. Therefore, with their hatred, I should take offense.
I like that.
Yes. So that's
Yeah.
my way. I'm like gonna swing open the doors. I said that. And so now here's Gemma. Tell me more of your story.
Oh, I mean, our topic today is really a heavy one,
Yeah.
war. And how do you process that? Like, it's so far removed from like what most people would consider like the peaceful ways of Buddhism, you
Exactly.
know? At the same time, I think there's a lot to learn from it because every day we're tackling our own battles,
Yeah.
and internal, external, whatever it is. And so reflection is a huge part of that. And I've learned so much about myself and about people and emotions and everything through this process. And growing up the way I did, I think it was very easy to make excuses, to blame others. And, looking back now, I see how much hurt that I caused others. Like I would lie about my mother and my father and my job or whatever it was. And it was a way to fit in because everything that we're talking about, I really think goes back to community
Yeah.
and people wanting to fit in. When we're born, we are born pure and wonderful. And we learn from our community and the people around us. Our first experiences are with maybe religion or with being a certain thing, a certain
Right.
label. And so it's up to us if we want to accept that label or not as we grow and learn from our own experiences. And so I didn't know any better when I was younger because I saw how my mom was and I reflected that and I had my values and really what I learned about those emotions then, I mean I didn't see it then, but what I learned was my brain was protecting me and I had some values. I was lying in order to protect myself in some way even though it doesn't necessarily make sense. But at
Yeah.
the time, I thought that.
Right.
So as I grew and went through these different experiences, I kind of came into this realization like, okay, we often ask ourselves, like, what we're doing wrong so we could fix it.
Mm-hmm.
When a lot of times we have to equally ask what we're doing right so we can get more of that.
Ah. Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think that can also be, you know, depending on your intent. I think we talk about intent a lot.
Yes.
And I feel like I'm probably going to go in circles as we have this conversation. But on the grand scheme of things, when we look at war and we look at these leaders and things like that, they were all born as children as well.
Yeah.
They, for whatever reason, grew up, made choices, and had experiences that led them to where they are today. And as I look back at my own childhood and think about like where some of my childhood friends are, I very easily say that could be me. I could be a drug addict. I could have committed or not death by suicide or whatever it is. Like that could have been me.
Right. Right.
And so that little piece there makes me kind of think, I have no idea what I would do if I had the same experiences as some of these people, maybe like Putin, for example.
Right.
I have no idea what happened in his life that made him get to this point. And I'm sure maybe it didn't start with bad or negative intent. Maybe he genuinely thought that the decisions that he was making was good, or at least they were good for him. And maybe he's still thinking that. I have no idea because I don't know what he's going what's going on in his head. I don't know what it's like to be responsible for an entire country or to make the decisions he's making.
Right.
But could it be me?
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to think not, but at the same time, I've made horrible experiences or made horrible decisions in my life. I just happen to change them.
Yeah, you're bringing up a valid point. I'm going to let you get back to it, but my teacher, Reverend Koyo Kabose, said to break down Buddhism into the simplest terms, like like impermanence and interdependence and emptiness, which means nothing is a discrete thing in and of itself, and that they're suffering and all that stuff. If you break it down to the simplest terms, it's a matter of conditions acting on person, place, and time.
Mm.
If the conditions that acted on, say, Putin or your mother or my mother or anything like that, if those conditions acted on that person at that time, because you know 50 years ago is different than now, and so person, place, and time makes can actually create a whole different person. Like it can turn into it can turn into Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It can turn a sweet person into a killer. And what makes like jihadis, like Hamas, do what they do. We can take our guesses because of sort of some of the things that happen to the Palestinians, but then again, we're not there. We don't know. And I think that's kind of what you're saying, right?
Absolutely. I mean, if I really break it down into a matter of life and death, if somebody comes to me with the intent to kill me and my family, I'm going to defend myself.
Right.
And if I were to kill them, of course, I would feel horrible because that wouldn't be necessarily my intent. But when it comes to defending my family, that is my intent.
Right.
So it it it's so hard because from a soldier perspective, I wouldn't necessarily go to war and every day I'm thinking like, oh yes, I'm an American and we're good. They're bad. Like that's not what most soldiers are thinking. Most soldiers are just thinking, I don't want to die. I want to protect my friends. And you do what you have to do in that situation because it, there's other people that have weapons or they want to harm you. And so, yeah, it's one of those things that, in Buddhism, I think a lot of people have this idea like, you can't eat animals, you can't step on ants, you can't do anything that's going to harm something. But at the same time, I also feel like there's this, we also talk about the middle path or the middle way a lot of times. And if you have to defend yourself or you have to do something that society has deemed good or bad or right or wrong, like stealing a loaf of bread to feed your family or something like that, there are situations that could be maybe reasonable to other people. And I don't know, it's hard to say that, I think.
No, I totally understand it. And that actually brings us up to the point of where, like, you reflect on all the, it's like we talk in Buddhism about emptiness, and so nothing is a discrete thing, right? Nothing is a
Mhm.
thing of itself without the people, places, and conditions that are acting upon it, right? Is what we're talking
Mhm.
about. Now, you talked about, like, so here you are, you're an American adolescent or early adult, and you feel like you have to get the heck out of the United States, and you join the army, and you have to get us. So there's this person, right? This person
Mhm.
to me doesn't seem like the person you are now, and probably not to you either. And you had a certain understanding of the United States. You bought into the overall culture of it, but yet you didn't like it, and vice versa. And then you got into the army, which has its own culture, I'm sure. And then you go to Ecuador, and I'm sure there's a whole culture there that you've absorbed and become a part of, and then you go to Ukraine, and then there's a culture there that you've become a part of. So like we can hop around and sort of like follow, like, what is that, 4 or 5 different gemmas, right?
Absolutely, yes.
And I think most people, if they were born in, like, say, Wisconsin, where you are, and they grew up in Wisconsin, and that's how they think, right? And that's what kind of creates the tribalism, and the this is how it is. Obviously, I'm right, you're wrong, everybody else is wrong. And it's like you've explained in our Sangha that all these cultures have so much to do with it. Even linguistically, that has so much to do with it.
Mhm.
So would you talk a little more about that? Because it's like, I think it would blow a lot of people away just to think about how many different people you are or have
It's
been.
Yeah, it's very true. So in my experience, when I talk about everything going back to community, people desperately want to fit in.
Yeah.
And I'm not an anthropologist or historian or anything, but from my understanding, it was a survival because who you were born to, you were born vulnerable, couldn't take care of yourself. So you had to get that love, affection, and protection and everything from your community. And
Right.
so people want that. And by doing so and wanting that, they create these labels, and
Mhm.
then they also segregate, or not segregate, but they put themselves apart from others. It's
Yes.
you versus me mentality. And so when we grow up, or when we're in a community and we see something or experience something that's different to what we know, there's maybe fear that goes into that because, oh, this is my community. We having something else come in might change things, or it's scary, or whatever it is. And that's kind of what happened with me as I was moving around. I had this one culture of coming from my mother. And then when you get into the military, it's like everybody's singing American songs and you're talking these things, and you want to fit in because
Right.
it's a matter of life or death. If you don't trust the people that you're next to, how do you know that you're going to survive?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
having a strong bond is really important. And if you, dare I say, go against that, you're ostracizing yourself from your own community. And how are you going to survive then is kind of where it goes. So when I went to Ecuador, I think I had the mentality like, okay, I can't be like the normal foreigner that comes here. I'm in somebody else's country. I need to adapt and integrate myself as much as possible so that I can fit in. And I did. Learn the language. Yeah.
Can I interrupt? Oh, I forgot. Why did you go to Ecuador, or did you tell us why you ended up going to Ecuador?
Okay. So
Because
I
that's a
had some
big jump.
medical,
Yeah.
that is a big jump. So when I moved to Ecuador, it was because I already have some autoimmune disorders as well. And I had some injuries when I was in the military, and I ended up having what's called a pseudotumor cerebri, and it was pretty much swelling of the brain. And they were giving me treatments very often for like lumbar punctures almost weekly. And they recommended that I get a shunt inserted into my brain, which I decided against. And since I couldn't work because of I was having medical issues and I had nobody except for myself to depend on at the time, I decided to pack up everything and move to Ecuador. And then when I was there, I magically got better. But that's a different thing. Some people say that it was related to my Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. But I don't know. I just know that it's gone, and that's great. So
Yeah, right. And so
wonderful.
you picked Ecuador because you were always interested in the South American culture, or
Not at all. Not at all. So again, growing up in actually a very racist household, my mother was extremely racist. So I kind of rebelled against her as I got older. And I was like, I don't care. I got to be friends with every foreigner in the school, every different race that I could in all of my different schools, just almost to piss her off in the beginning.
I get it.
But then I realized that I made connections with these people and it started to change me. And then I was no longer that same person anyway. So I knew that I wanted to move to a foreign country. So I had to make my decision, okay, which country? And Ecuador, I had read that there was a lot of like retirees that could afford to go down there on their pension. Also, Ecuador uses the US dollar instead of their own country, like currency.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, okay, I think Spanish would be easy to learn. I could do it. And it's not too far from the United States. And I don't have to worry about conversion fees. So I packed 2 suitcases and showed up there in the middle of the night. And I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing? So it didn't speak a word of English or Spanish, I'm sorry, at all there. And then had to just learn. And so after living there for, quite a few years, I loved it. I tried my best to fit in. I learned Spanish, started translating for foreigners that would come down. And it was really wonderful. Everybody that was Ecuadorian in my little neighborhood, they treated me as if I was their own. And so at the same time, I also learned that no country is perfect because
Right.
in the United States, there's always battles and debates on politics. Well, the
Yeah.
same goes for Ecuador and even Ukraine. Also, I think in the United States, there's also, again, this community where it's us versus them. And so some Americans maybe don't like Mexicans or whatever it is, and there's that dispute. Well, the same in Ecuador. In Ecuador, it was like, oh, but the Cubans and the Colombians. And so I realized then that no matter where you go, your community always has their eye on other people as well, us versus them.
Right. Creating others out of everyone else, right?
Yes, you said that beautifully. So it really does happen. And even within the community, like in Ecuador, there is a lot of racism. There's a large population of Afro-Ecuadorians, and then there's indigenous, and then there's what they call mestizos, which are mixed European. And so there's colorism. So when we talk about racism, well, within the communities, there's also colorism. Lighter skinned people of a certain ethnic group are treated differently. And so the community aspect is very interesting to me because it's just, I mean, the way people think and try to bond and everything.
Right.
There's that sense of community, there's that sense of belonging, but as you said, creating others out of
Everyone else not like
yeah.
us. And
Exactly.
not like us at the time, too. I mean, it's like because we change, right? Like you've been how many Gemmas we've already said. So you left Ecuador
Hmm.
and went to Ukraine because you met your husband at Microsoft when you began working for Microsoft, correct? That's the story?
Yes. So I
Okay.
worked at Microsoft, and I met my husband, and then went over to Ukraine and married him, and then we've been together ever since. So
So tell me about your experience in Ukraine prior to the invasion. I mean, there was always Russia causing problems even prior to this 2000 whatever it was 21, right? 2021 major invasion. But they
mm,
invaded before in like 2014, and I don't know if you were there then, the Crimea and all that, but were you saw that culture too, right? And even
yeah.
though it was Ukrainian culture, it still had those same earmarks that we're discussing, right? Right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, with you go there and you listen to your Ukrainians, and they're talking about like the Belarusians and then the Russians, just like, maybe we talk about Mexicans, Canadians, or whatever it is. It's always something. And I've noticed, and I think this is just a thing among people with different cultures, you do change when you go into the different cultures or when you speak the different languages. So like when I was in Ecuador, I dressed a certain way and spoke a certain way. And it's really funny because sometimes people are like, when they hear me speak Spanish and they're a Spanish speaker, the accent that I have and the way I look, they assume that I'm from Argentina. And they're like, but you don't sound like a white person, or you don't look like you're from this country. And I'm like, well, I'm from the United States. And then I'm like, oh, but you speak like us. So you're our community now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You'll put in the effort. And just because of that little effort that I took to learn a language, then, or the culture even, that made a connection between us.
Right. And then the tribe adopts you.
Yes. And same, with going to Ukraine, it's like, okay, well, I'm in Ukraine. I don't even understand this alphabet. It looks like backwards English to me.
It
Like,
certainly
what
does.
is this? So I went in with a lot of maybe common misunderstandings or perceptions as an American. I thought, well, Russia and Ukraine are the same, right? Like, isn't Ukrainian language just a dialect of Russian? And it's not the case at all. Like,
Yeah.
Ukrainian language is actually closer to Polish than it is Russian. It's just they share the same Cyrillic alphabet.
Yeah. And I've only recently learned that. And, because you wouldn't know that in America. I mean, you kind of lump all those Eastern European countries together. And if it was like a former Russian country, well, it's Russia, right?
Yeah,
Plain and simple, open and shut.
exactly. And not to mention, with the language aspect, if you don't speak another language, it's a lot of information that you're not getting because you're only getting either the positive or negative propaganda in your own
Yeah.
language.
Yeah.
So we were actually in America, I would say, influenced by Russian propaganda. Like if you look at maps and things like this, Ukrainian capital city, I think most Americans learned a lot of geography and
We
pronunciations
did in the
during this.
last couple years. Yeah.
So I think that most people would say, let me say it in the Russian way if I even can, Kiev. Kiev
Kiev.
is what most Americans would say. It's written on most maps in Russian translation rather than Ukrainian. So I think it was Kiev,
Right.
and that's the Russian transliteration. So it's not like we were already given this propaganda and it spread like wildfire. So Americans only know their perspective and
Do you know
Russian
why?
perspective.
I'm just curious now. This is my curiosity overcoming me. Why in the world would we adopt the Russian propagandist linguistic, like I was raised thinking it was Kiev, not Kiev. And it's like, why in the world did our country adopt the Russian rather than the Ukrainian, which we are very American people are akin to Polish people. So why do you understand? I don't get that. Why did that happen? Do you know?
Well, Russian propaganda, they are so good at it, right?
Yeah, oh, good point. Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's it's really a matter of, well, I guess an American saying might be the squeaky wheel gets the oil.
Okay.
So when you put the information out there enough, whether it's true or not, it sticks,
Absolutely. That makes
right?
perfect sense. Yeah.
And we can say that about ourselves and our own experience. Maybe we told ourselves some lie in the past, like we weren't good enough or whatever, but we said it so often that we believe it, even though it might not necessarily be true.
True. Got it.
So, yeah, Russia has a lot of propaganda techniques that they use. They also, like when they go and start wars and things like that, some of the first things that happen are disinformation,
Yeah.
right? Nowadays, we're seeing AI generated photographs and videos.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another aspect on top of things that people don't necessarily know what's true and false, even.
Right.
So, and then there's the actual, I guess, deportation and killing of people. So Russia has this habit of starting with artists and scholars and burning books and things like that, because if they can get rid of the culture, then it doesn't exist. And so people can't say that it's important or whatever. And so
Yeah.
that's what they did. That's what is happening now. So, for example, Russia takes children and deports like thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia, takes them from their parents, and then integrates them into Russian society. And children are the most vulnerable because
Right.
they want to belong and they learn. So if you're hearing from other Russians that, oh, we saved you from Ukraine, Ukrainians are bad and this and that, they raise them in that, and hopefully that sticks.
Right. Right.
So, I mean, there's really so many aspects, but how American adopted it is, I think that the Russian propaganda was just more widely available at the time. So
Right.
what they don't think something so simple as a spelling could be wrong.
Right, right. I
Okay.
remember I remember the first time I heard Kiev in the way I heard it in my head always all growing up was Kiev was back when the hubbub was around the Trump forcing uh the Ukrainian
Mm.
president to lie about Biden, and then he caused trouble for the ambassador, and then it's the first time I ever, and they all the testimony in this stuff was they kept talking saying Kiev, and it was the first time I heard it, and it was like, I mean, I'm 71 years old, so that was only a couple of years ago. It's like, oh wow, how could I be so ignorant?
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's not our fault. That's what we were taught or learned. It's a matter of when we're presented with the truth, do we choose to accept that or not? And
Yeah. And only you, Gemma, coming from the propaganda that is widely distributed in the American culture and the propaganda that is distributed in the Ecuadorian culture, and then the propaganda in the Ukrainian culture distributed either by Ukraine or Russia, only you can say, oh, this is propaganda. I
it's
mean, I think it almost takes
absolutely.
yeah, it does almost takes the ability to like be plopped out of your propagandish place to another place to see that it is in fact a lie.
Oh yeah. I mean, when you're in America, you're like, wow, we're American, land of the free, and we have freedom of speech and all these freedoms, and it's amazing here. And it wasn't until I lived elsewhere, I'm like, wow, like, especially in the last few years,
Yeah, yeah.
I know maybe this would be upsetting to some people, but I think America hit its peak, and the mindset hasn't changed, but economy and rights and things like that have almost regressed or
Absolutely.
degraded. So I felt like, for example, in Ecuador and Ukraine, I felt like I had so many more freedoms because I could do essentially what I wanted because they trusted people as individuals. Like, it's your life, you're responsible for it. And so while they do have some laws, it's like, if I wanted to have a house in Ecuador and paint it pink, I mean, I could do that and not have to worry about an HOA or something coming to me telling me, oh, this doesn't go with our community guidelines.
Or zoning laws or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So if I want to build a shed in my yard, I don't have to get a permit or do this. And I understand that it was born out of safety and concern. But then there was this threshold, I think, that it became where just don't trust the people to make their own decisions anymore.
No,
So
I hear you. I mean, I see both sides of that. But yet at the same time, we just put up a privacy fence and had to get it approved, had to get the drawings approved, and now we have to call, it's now installed, and we have to call and get it inspected, even though like it's just a silly fence. I mean, come on. So I
yeah,
mean, it's not like a house or anything. It's like, but
yeah.
I get why it happens, to sort of protect uniformity, make safety codes and so forth. But at the same time, I think the deeper issue here that I think we're like talking about is that it's, I hate to use this analogy because it really is gross, but it's like the boiling frog. Have you heard about it? If you boil frog slowly enough, it doesn't know it's being boiled and it won't jump out of the pot.
Oh, yeah,
Okay. So
absolutely.
so it's like, I think in our country, if we have grown up and if we've not been anywhere else, right? If we've grown up, and I think this is not just true for the United States, although I think it may be worse for us because we're like the spoiled brats of the universe, or in my mind, kind of in a way. But anyway, I think if we've grown up long enough thinking like we're the best and everything we do is right and this has got to be the way it is, and everybody else is are these backwater, you know, backwater hoodlums or whatever. Do you know what I mean? And they're just not smart enough to figure it all out. That's sort of kind of ingrained in us, unless we're like in another place long enough to see that, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I had all of those same feelings myself. I thought Ecuador and Ukraine, like, oh, these are like second and third world countries, and
Countries.
they're probably so disgusting and poor. And like, I had these initial thoughts. And it wasn't until I lived there that it's like, well, you know what? There's good and bad places everywhere you go, right? And coming from Ukraine recently, it I mean, coming to Wisconsin, I know it's a little different maybe than San Francisco or New York or some of these other places, but coming to Wisconsin specifically, it felt like stepping back in time because where we lived, it was very modern.
Uh-huh.
And it was like, wow, like I didn't know people still did this, or I have to pay with a card. Like I can't just use my phone, or like it just these little tiny things that were just so different. And when we got back, we were just bombarded with like advertisements and political ads and all of this stuff. And I think what I noticed the most is how people, and this also could be with the internet as well, but people are stuck in a bubble. And on the internet, your content is curated for you. So if you have racist tendencies, that's what's going to be shown to you.
Right.
So unless you make the conscious decision to get out of that bubble and make a connection with somebody else, then you're just going to stay there, and it's going to be this cycle. And I think that was definitely for me. I think because I'm also a coach, and as a coach and someone that considers themselves Buddhist, like I had this struggle for a long time where I'm like, these are what I am. So I should represent and be the best possible version of that. So if I'm really angry, does that make me less of one of these things?
Yeah.
Or I almost felt embarrassed, like, oh, I can't coach people when I'm going through this, or I can't talk about Buddhism when I'm going through this.
That is so true. And that brings us to the anger part.
Yes.
Because and I know this is harder for you, but here you were, you had to flee your country, you had to flee your home, you had to flee your family. And I suppose you had a choice. I mean, you could have stayed there, and you can talk about this, but you chose to flee. But in dealing with the anger, and I bring this up because and one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on now is the anger that's swirling around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's taking place in the Gaza Strip and Israel. It's so fiery, and it's so hard to reconcile for those that are looking at it from one side or the other, as well as those of us who really don't have a side per se. And you must have had unbelievable amounts of anger towards the Russians. And so can you tell us a little bit about how that all felt, and about what you had to do and why you had to do it, and how you got over, if you not maybe got over, because maybe you didn't, but how you are processing that?
Yeah, even to this day, I mean, I can sit here and say these nice things and make it sound easy, but there's still days or moments that anger boils up, and I have to stop and think about the things that I'm telling everyone and also myself. And so it's just a matter of continuing to do that. And the more I do it, the easier that it gets. So really leading up to the full-scale invasion, of course, there was a war before. And what a lot of Americans may not realize is that a lot of Ukrainians felt United States and some other countries were responsible, because United States had asked Ukraine to get rid of their nuclear weapons, and they would protect them if they did. So Ukraine, we gave up nuclear weapons, and then within a very short amount of time, Russia took over, how would you say, Crimea is how.
I mean, I don't know how it's supposed to be said. I said Crimea. You could.
Yeah, Crimea.
I'm wrong.
So no. It's just a matter of, I want to say it the way people, because in Ukrainian it's actually Krim, so it's very different. But Crimea, yeah. So it was like, then people were like, "Hey, you guys told us to get rid of the thing that protected us, and now you are not protecting us." So the war had been happening on the East Coast. And to give a little perspective as well, Ukraine is one of the largest countries in Europe. And Ukraine is about the size of Texas, if that helps.
That does.
So the entire eastern side of Ukraine was pretty much at war. We would consistently hear like stories of soldiers being killed and things like that. And another thing that happens is, on the western side of Ukraine, the language is pretty much Ukrainian. but they have like mix of Hungarian and also Russian as well. So it's like this dialect almost. Whereas the further west you go, the more Russian it is because there's more Russian influence, propaganda, and also they took over Ukrainian schools and started making them speak Russian and things like that.
Ah, yeah.
So just a matter of language is very political. So when you open your mouth to talk to somebody, depending on how you talk, they're going to label you automatically.
Unbelievable. And so imagine that happening here. Although we kind of do, because if we hear sort of a drawl from Texas,
Yeah.
right, we maybe make bad connections, right?
Absolutely. That does happen. So, you know, as far as kind of what was leading up to it, in Ukraine, of course, there's Ukrainian and Russian language. And the media and news, of course, are in Ukrainian and Russian. So, one of the other ways Russia was able to use propaganda is because they infiltrate the media and they put out disinformation within Ukraine that they want.
Right.
So any sort of Ukrainian independent news stations and things like that, you would often hear of them getting murdered or something like that.
Wow.
That happened because, again, Russia knows that if you put out this information in your language, this is what's going to happen.
Wow.
So what happened leading up to that was normally you hear about a couple of, soldiers dying on the west or the east of Ukraine, but most people lived normal lives. And I think it was maybe something happened in December or January. I can't really remember, but I woke up one morning and I had a ton of messages from my foreign friends saying, Gemma, are you okay? Like, what's going on? I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. What's going on? So I Googled it and I hear all of this stuff about Russia because fortunately, we do speak other languages. So being able to access American media and things like that was very beneficial to us.
Right. And you could share it with people who couldn't, right? How your Ukrainian friends and family.
So yeah, because they weren't getting that information. Even like it was scary because even the weeks leading up to it, all the time people are like, what's going on? And the full-scale invasion happened on like the 24th of February 2022. And even like the very, very beginning of February, I had people, why aren't you leaving? And nothing is being reported in Ukraine at all. I'm like, I don't know. I just ordered Domino's. Everything is absolutely fine. Like nothing is different. I'm going to get my nails done.
Domino's. I love it. Okay,
so
got it.
It was a very different sensation as far as media. And then I had media actually reach out to me and say, can we interview you? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And I was like, well, I'm listening to American media. And the thing that kind of worries me is if they do invade airstrikes and things like that. And we had a very lengthy, quite a few different conversations on Zoom. And I happened to look for like the news source and I see my face and then I see like Russian tanks in the background. I'm like, they edited out so much and just picked the parts that they wanted to in order to show that on the news.
Yeah, it was a shock and awe. It was clickbait. Yeah, right.
Exactly. Clickbait. And so that's happening to so many people around the world, right? Again,
right.
This propaganda that they want you to believe something.
Right.
And this is another thing that I really realized was that people tend to romanticize war. You have to pick good or bad. There's always a good or bad. You have to choose sides.
Yeah, good point.
And that's not the case. Like, just because people want Ukraine to win, right, is their word. We want Ukraine to win. Doesn't negate all of the bad things that happen in Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah.
there is corruption and there are problems like with the government and with banks and all of these things. And it's just, you know, it's difficult sometimes because people want to just disregard all of that and choose good or bad. And same with Russia. Like, I have never lived in Russia, so I can't say I know a lot of Russian people, but I'm sure that not every person is bad, you know?
Yeah, I'm
And
pretty sure. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure. And just like, even if I think of like Putin or somebody, people get this idea in their head that every day that, oh, Putin, every day he's just plotting how to destroy the world. And like, or even when it comes to refugees, people have this image of refugees in their head that are maybe not well dressed or not well educated, or they're always sad or something like this. And that's just not how it works. People go through a range of emotions, happiness, sadness, whatever it is. And that is important to remember. So when it comes to my feelings of like leaving Ukraine, every choice is very personal when
Yeah.
you're in that situation. And fortunately, we had actually just sold our house. So
You mean
we
you had
were living,
already sold the house?
we had already sold our house. And so we were living in an apartment. And like I kept hearing this news and it was making me worried. And I was telling my husband, mate, let's just go to Poland for a little bit, like take a vacation or something like that. And he's
Where
like,
in
nothing's.
where in Ukraine did you live?
So we actually lived in a few places. I mean, we did live in Kyiv.
Uh-huh.
Then I don't know if you've seen on the news, there was a place called Irpin
Oh yeah,
or
yeah, yeah.
Irpin. Yeah.
I'm
So
learning a lot about the geography. Yeah, right.
yeah, so European, it was so crazy because that was hit really bad and we almost bought a house there. Like I
Wow.
looked at a school and I saw it just completely demolished on the news because that's where we were going to send our daughter. And so it was really crazy to actually see that. And, you know, my my daughter often asks, well, we ended up moving to the west.
Uh-huh.
There's some cities there like Lviv,
Lviv,
and
yeah.
like further down in like Zakarpattia region is like Uzhhorod and things like that. But anyway, um, we decided, okay, we're gonna go to Poland just in case, like we'll pack up. And everybody's like, why are we? Nothing's gonna happen. Up until the very day it happened, nobody in Ukraine knew. Nobody was like, oh yeah, this is gonna happen. Unless they spoke English and believed the media,
Yeah,
nothing was
because
gonna.
the American media was telling that all the time. This is going to happen.
Yeah.
This is going to happen. It's like we have secret ways of knowing this, and we know they're going to invade. And it was
Yep.
even reported to us that nobody in Ukraine believed it.
Yep. That's absolutely true. So we ended up packing up and we got to Warsaw, Poland, the day before the full-scale invasion.
Oh my gosh.
And so while originally we just thought, well, maybe things will blow over, nothing will be bad, we'll just go for a vacation and come back.
Yeah, right.
You know, as soon as we got there, I don't know, I woke up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and I happened to check my phone and it was just like this moment of, oh my God, it happened. And I woke my husband up and we tried to get a hold of our family. And then it was all of a sudden all these feelings at once because it was like happiness that we were safe.
Right.
It was guilt that we left our family.
Right.
It was worry because like what is going to happen? Like this actually happened. We never would have imagined that this would happen. It was not reported anything. And what's going to happen next?
Right. And
And
are you
so
safe in Poland?
that was another thing because rockets don't know an invisible boundary. You
Right.
can try, but even now there's reports of like pieces falling in Poland and Romania and things like that. So, I mean, you can only do so much. And there was some issues with Russia taking over nuclear power plants, because Ukraine has a lot of them. They even have one of the largest in all of Europe. And
Right.
contamination, the wind is going to move right into
And I
Europe, the
wondered about,
water,
yeah,
all of that. And people don't realize like the prices in the United States are changing because food
of the war, right.
comes from, yeah, it comes from Ukraine, like fertilizer comes from Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. So it is impacting us on some level. And I think that in that moment, when all of this stuff happened, it was so overwhelming. Everybody was just like, we hate Russians. And I was like, yeah, me too. I can't believe this happened. Like, I was so furious.
Right.
And I would post even on social media content saying like, Russia is awful and things like this.
Of course you did, because yeah, you were caught up and you had to get it out, and you were feeling all
Yeah,
that. Like I read that statement about uh President Biden, like the rage, the rage, the rage, it's just overcoming you, right?
exactly. And so, and apart from that, going back to the community, if I were to say anything, it could potentially make my family and friends question, because it's like, why are you siding with the Russians? Or why would you defend them? Or something like that. So it would be almost, if I kind of defended them, like I was separating myself from my friends and family.
Right, right.
So it was a lot to process. And it ended up on Instagram. An acquaintance from Norway, he sent me a video from a Russian professor, and I watched it. And I think that was really the first time I was like, you know what? Yeah, like not every Russian is a bad person, right? It's not this good versus bad. And then when I started reading more with an open mind into the media, I would see Russian soldiers are being killed like nonstop. And that didn't make me feel good. I mean,
No.
it didn't. And so I had to start thinking, like, as a soldier myself, like,
Yeah, especially
I don't
because of that.
have Yeah, I don't have a choice. I'm going in, I'm doing what my leadership is telling me. I don't necessarily have the full picture, but I know that I don't want to die. And so I can imagine from their perspective that happening too. Of course, in situations you have people that don't always have pure or good intent.
Right.
So there are complete atrocities happening. Not gonna discount that at all. At the same time, that's happening from Ukrainian forces as well.
Exactly.
So,
And I've seen that, and there's been some things written about it, but people like to, there's the good guys and the bad guys, and in the way they look at that, then they can't see the other. And this, not that you can really comment on Israel and Pakistani and Hamas, but yet again you can. I'm going to ask you to,
mhm,
because the rage on both sides of this issue. And I don't know if you look at this as from a side perspective, because a lot of people in the United States do. They're either very, very pro-Israeli, or they're very, very pro-Pakistani, or they're very. But if you look at this just the way you're talking about it, like there aren't good guys and bad guys. There are horrible things that are done,
mhm,
and war in and of itself is horrible. It's like, that old song that I grew up with, war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing, right?
mhm,
And you probably don't even know it, you're too young. So because it was about the Vietnamese War, which was the war I protested in my day.
mhm,
So, but the thing about it is that it's like the rage that both sides feel, we can identify with it on both sides, right? But at the same
mhm,
time, in our social media, in the mainstream media, and it's the drumbeat of all of this just makes us all crazy in sort of. Do you know what I'm saying? And I wondered if you, when this all happened here, and I know how kind of post-traumatic stress disorder works, did it make you feel that those feelings again, or did you just tune it out because it wasn't related? And
No, of course. I mean, there's more than just these two wars happening.
oh,
There's
exact Syria.
things going on in Africa. So, like, the way I see it is we only get a small perspective.
Yep.
We all only use our five senses. And then on top of that, we use our experiences. And so it's just a very small perspective of what's happening overall. And when we think about things, like, people so often look at a situation and think like, oh, I can change this. Or if we did this, we could change the war, or we could change this outcome.
Right.
But looking at it the most basic level, think about how hard it is for us to change ourselves.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
if we have such a difficult time changing ourselves, what makes us think that we can change others and even entire nations?
Exactly.
So when it comes to helping and we think about like our perspectives and what's going on, I think it's important to acknowledge what's happening. So when I look at the situation, my initial thought was, I kind of want to side with like the Palestine, because from my perspective, Israel is somewhat like Russia, because with the Gaza Strip and everything, it's like those people were treated poorly. They were treated like second-rate citizens of something that didn't even belong to anywhere or anyone.
Right.
So at the same time, when I look at it from a different perspective and slow myself down, it's like, I don't know the culture. I don't know the language. I don't know what's true and false, because I'm getting media that is edited. I'm getting information that's biased. I'm getting information that is just not necessarily true because I haven't experienced it. So it's, I can't say one side is good or bad. I mean, I often think of, well, what would happen if United States went to war with Ukraine? Where would I side? What if Ukraine went to war with Ecuador? Where would I side? If I'm living in Ecuador and Ukraine is attacking, well, it would be in my best interest almost to side with Ecuador.
Well, of course. Yes, exactly.
Right? Yeah. So even though they are like both my countries, right? So I think looking at this situation and how to process it and how to help, I think just saying that what is happening, there's no right or wrong side. I'm sure that they're both doing what they feel is best to protect their people.
Right.
Whether they're making good choices or not, I mean, that's beside itself. But they are also all families. They were all babies at one point that had experiences to just make themselves different from each other.
Right.
And I mean, they have families and children and all of these things. I think at the end of the day, most people just want to live their lives in the best possible way. And what's happening doesn't change that.
No. And it's like the Dalai Lama says, my religion is kindness, and it's like a lot of the Buddhist teachings and a lot of our vows, it's all about may all beings be happy, may all beings be at peace. I mean, that is all any of us really want. I mean, but in the recent years, the divisiveness, I mean, we're at each other's throats about whether someone's wearing a mask or not. I mean, it's like, it's not even bombs. It's like, it's like it is. It's hard. Like I think you said it something about sometimes you think that our culture, the American culture, is going backwards and losing freedoms, and I think we've gotten nuts, to be honest with you. And it's like, but it's like I do believe that we think I think social media does this, is like, I think Andy Warhol, who's somebody also you probably don't know or haven't heard of because you're too young, but he was this pop culture icon, an abstract painter and stuff. And he said he believes at some point in the future, everyone will be famous for 20 minutes. I think social media made it so that we all think we have an opinion and our opinion is right and we're entitled to give it. And it's like, I just think we should all shut up, really, honestly. I have
Yeah.
to, do you know what I mean? So I think what you're saying is true. If we didn't have so many opinions, I think then we'd have time to think about how they were all babies, and that we don't know what made Putin, and we don't know what made we just don't know
Yeah.
what makes terrorists, and we just don't know. And if I were in the same situation as they were when they were children, I might be exactly the same. Hopefully not, but maybe I would.
Yeah.
And I think you said that at the beginning, and I think you really brought it full circle. And boy, yeah, you didn't disappoint, Gemma. I mean, I think everything that you said is something that I think a lot of people would not have the benefit of understanding because they have not lived through all the different experiences that you have. And so before we close, is there anything else you wanted to say?
Oh, I could go on. I mean, it's a lot to unpack in a short amount of time.
Right.
And, there's so many people in the United States and other parts of the world that want to help. And I think that's beautiful. And I think going about it from how can we help locally? Because I know that's the question. Where do I donate? What do I want to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
There were people that were on this trend of donating to Airbnbs. And while
in Ukraine, I remember this. Yes.
yes. And I mean, from a Ukrainian perspective, it was like all of the rich people have these Airbnbs. The people that are affected by the war the most do not have extra houses and rooms lying around. And apart from that, a lot of oligarchs and pro-Russian people have Airbnbs as investments.
Right.
So potentially those people that donated were funding the war. Or something like Red Cross. We're familiar with Red Cross here, and that might be a good organization here in the United States. However, in Ukraine, it is very corrupt. They are a part of the community that's deporting Ukrainian children to Russia because they are corrupt. So even though that we have our own viewpoints and experiences and we're getting these things from social media and everything else, it's like before you jump on that train and you don't know the culture, you don't know what's going on, take a step back and think about what you can do in your own community. Like maybe it's just something as simple as reaching out to your local like Jewish community or the Palestinians in your community or the Ukrainians in your community, and without any sort of judgment, share a coffee, share a meal, just talk. You don't have to provide financial or material items in order to change the world. I think when you just share that connection and connect to somebody that's different than you.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
that's where you can help. That's where you can make the difference. Have your children be friends with children of different religions or countries or whatever. Because what I'm hearing a lot lately is this hate crime that's happening here in the United States.
Right.
And it's like, why do you need to get if they would just talk and get to know people first and make a connection, then that situation would be avoided. So I think that would be what I want to leave everyone with.
Yeah.
Is just taking a moment to stop and realizing, what is it that you can do? How can you change your perspective? How can you look from within and do something locally? Because you can't, I mean, like I said, you can barely change yourself because it's so difficult. So thinking that you can have this huge impact on the world or the war, absolutely. But it starts with yourself first and
Exactly.
making that connection.
Exactly. And I think you made a really good point about introducing your children to other children of different cultures, nationality, races, so forth. And because that's what creates, like, sort of the situation that creates that that sense of hate crime. Because if someone's raised in a family who is extremely racist and they use derogatory terms towards, racist, xenophobic, whatever, homophobic. And so if those slurs get bandied about in their household, and they, those things happen, well, that's how they're going to be, right? That's how they're going to think. That is exactly how they're going to think. So that is true. And for those of us that, I think a lot of times Americans are so they just think our money will solve everything. And I think it was an important point about the Red Cross can be corrupt. That's not like this. And I'm not saying the American Red Cross is corrupt, but I don't know, because there's this huge organization that the money isn't getting into the hands of the people. The clothes aren't getting into the hands of the people. It's like, just even if it's not something that is directly related to the wars or whatever, just, our closed drop box at your local church and the local food pantry, just that, that's something. And you can consider it a war effort if you want. You know what I'm saying? It's helping people, then that's important. So it's great you brought that up, Gemma. Thank you so much. And thank you for being a guest on the podcast. This is, I think, the first time we had on the public podcast, we had a member of our community. So this is a first. So, and I'm very thrilled to be able to have you on. And I'm going to promote, Gemma has written a book that hopefully will be released sometime soon, maybe in the next year, in 2024. The working title, and then maybe the ultimate title, will be Surviving Patriotism, which sounds absolutely awesome. Love the title. So when the book is released, we'll have you back on again as
that sounds great.
the author of a newly released book. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, for having me. I know this is a topic that's on a lot of people's minds, and they want to just learn how to process it or what they can do. And I think it's important to talk about, especially from a perspective where there's no judgment and you can see both sides. And what would you do if you were in that position? Or, I think it's just so important to have these types of conversations instead of pointing fingers and blaming and not wanting to hear other perspectives.
Yes, exactly. And also being able to be open with our feelings and say, hey, we don't know. We just don't know. If that's the thing about in Zen Buddhism, we talk about I don't know mind, right? I don't know. And we walk around, I think, parade around a lot saying we have the answers, we have the opinions, we have the it's wonderful just to talk to somebody and say, I didn't know what to think. I didn't know how to think. I don't know how to feel. It is this is how I saw it from my perspective. So that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
It's so good. And I think another important thing is to remember that, you know, acknowledging these emotions is important, but realizing too that what we would consider negative emotions can also be the catalyst for change.
Yes.
And if I'm angry about something, it might motivate me to make a change. Or if I'm sad about something, it might motivate me to do something. So I'm sitting here having this conversation with you, and maybe people might think, wow, she's got it all together. And that's not necessarily the case. Something might happen tomorrow, and I'm going to be so angry and raging for a moment.
Yes. And that's it. It's like I've always said, and it's like Buddhist, everybody thinks Buddhists are, so peaceful. And then they, and if you're like somebody like a Buddhist teacher or a podcaster or a community, then they think you really have it all together. And it's like, I always, and Gemma, you'll testify, I always testify all the time on Sangha. I tell stories about how I get mad and how I get angry and how I mean, it's just like, if we pretend that that's happening, then we are denying people's ability to come to terms with their own anger. If we're pretending that we got our shit together.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I'm glad neither one of us do, because that made it for a good conversation.
Absolutely. Yes. I'm excited. I think, like I said, I'm just so thankful that you had me on and we were able to have this discussion. So
all right. Well, thanks again, Gemma. You have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for being a wonderful podcast guest. That's it for this conversation with Gemma. I'm sure you got a lot out of what she shared. These are tough times for all of us, but the more we try to talk to each other rather than doom scroll and find reasons to choose sides on any issues, the better you, your neighbors, your family, your town, and the world will feel. I hope this episode gave you some things to think and talk about. Next up, some announcements. We are newly into a study of the Pure Land Sutras in the Everyday Sangha, where you can join me and others, including Gemma, in our private donation-supported Sangha that meets virtually via Zoom every other week on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. The Sangha is studying the Pure Land Sutras with the book Great Faith, Great Wisdom, Practice and Awakening in the Pure Land Sutras of Mahayana Buddhism by Ratnaguna. Our meetings consist of a service first, including traditional vow recitations and other invocations like refuge, bodhisattva vows, etc., chanting, and a short meditation period. The service introduces more ritual and liturgy into the structure of our meeting, much like you would find at a non-virtual Buddhist temple, Buddhist church, or Buddhist Sangha. The service includes a Dharma talk by one of the practice leaders, or myself, Wendy Shinyo Sensei, and sometimes Dharma glimpses by our Sangha members. After the service, we open it up to discussion of the current book study, or of anything that was inspired by one of the Dharma talks or by everyday life. Consider joining the Sangha at this time to be a part of this relatively new sutra study and the practice, and a warm and welcome Sangha community. You can learn more about the Sangha by viewing the latest bonus YouTube podcast, where me, Bradley Sensei, and Terry Sensei, our practice leaders, talk about what the Sangha and what everyday Buddhism is all about. You can also support this podcast and the other activities of Everyday Buddhism by becoming a community member for $5 a month. If you do, you will have access to all members-only podcasts, an education series, the Introduction to Buddhism course, the new Everyday Buddhist Book Club, and a private group on a non-Facebook platform. If you don't follow me or Everyday Buddhism on any social media platforms we post in, you can go to the Everyday Buddhism website and join the membership community or the Everyday Sangha. Go to www.everyday-buddhism.com and click on either the tab that says Join Members Community or Join Everyday Sangha. Or you can join through Patreon at patreon.com/Everyday Buddhism. Links to joining the Everyday Sangha and the membership community are posted in the show notes. I thank all of you who contribute. This podcast, the community, and the Sangha depend on your donations to continue to exist. I don't seek sponsorships, and I don't ask for financial commitments through a paid podcast membership. So my work and the cost needed to support everything I do is entirely self-funded except for your donations. Please consider a one-time or continuing donation through Patreon or on my website's Donate tab. And if you're not ready to donate on a monthly basis or even a one-time donation, you can buy me a coffee on the coffee cup link on the website. You can find all these links in the show notes. And thanks, too, to all of you who write in with comments and questions. As the latest bonus member podcast illustrates, I read your emails and may even pick your question to feature in a bonus podcast. Another way you can help is to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. It's important to share the podcast with others if you find it helpful in your life. And if you could, take a minute to comment so people will know why you love Everyday Buddhism. That's all for the announcements for this time. So until next time, keep finding ways to make yours and everyone's days better.